The universe was old, older than most beings could truly understand. And in that ancient darkness between stars, civilizations had risen, learned, and conquered the one enemy that haunted all living things, death itself. The Vethkari were the first to achieve it. Their scientists had cracked the code of cellular decay roughly 12 million years before a small blue planet in an unremarkable corner of the galaxy would birth a species called humans. The Vethkari were tall, slender beings with skin like polished silver and eyes that held the weight of countless centuries. They had watched stars explode and reform. They had seen galaxies drift and merge. And they had never, not once in all those endless years, buried one of their own. After them came the Sonduin, massive creatures of living stone who thought in patterns so slow that a single conversation might last a decade. Then the crystalline Orcs, who existed as networks of light trapped in geometric structures that could repair themselves indefinitely. Then dozens more, hundreds more, until the galaxy was filled with beings who had simply forgotten what it meant to end. They called themselves the Elder Races, and they had built a civilization that spanned millions of worlds. They had libraries that contained the complete history of the cosmos. They had art that had been refined over timescales that made mountains seem temporary. They had peace, because war seemed pointless when you had forever to find better solutions. And then, 300 years ago by their reckoning, their long-range sensors detected something peculiar on a small world orbiting an average yellow star. Life, intelligent life. Tool-using, language-speaking, civilization-building life. This was not unusual. The Elder Races had cataloged thousands of intelligent species over the eons. What made this discovery different was a single, horrifying detail that appeared in every scan, every observation, every biological analysis. These creatures died, not from violence, though they had plenty of that. Not from accident, though those happened too. They died simply because their bodies stopped working. Their cells broke down. Their organs failed. Their minds faded into nothing. The longest lived among them rarely saw more than 100 revolutions of their planet around its star. The Vethkari researcher, who first compiled the report on humanity, spent 3 years simply trying to understand how such a species could function. How did they build anything, knowing they would not live to see it completed? How did they form relationships, knowing those relationships would end in loss? How did they wake up each morning, knowing that each day brought them closer to absolute nothing? The report, when it was finally submitted to the Council of Eternal Minds, was titled On the Tragedy of Temporal Limitation. It described humanity as a species trapped in a kind of slow-motion horror. Conscious beings who were aware of their own approaching end but powerless to prevent it. The Vethkari researcher recommended observation only. Contact would serve no purpose. What could these doomed creatures possibly offer to beings who had conquered time itself? The council agreed. The vote was unanimous. For the next 3 centuries, the Elder Races watched humanity from a distance. They observed as the small creatures spread across their world, building cities and tearing them down, fighting wars and making peace, creating art and science and philosophy despite the shadow that hung over every single one of them. The immortal scholars found it fascinating in the way that one might find a particularly complex insect fascinating. The psychologists tried to understand how humans could laugh, could love, could hope, when they knew with absolute certainty that everything they built would eventually slip from their fingers. The philosophers debated whether beings with such short existences could truly be considered conscious in any meaningful sense, or whether they were simply biological machines running through predetermined motions until their power ran out. Some of the younger immortals, those who had only lived a few 100,000 years, felt something almost like pity for the humans. The older ones felt nothing at all. They had seen countless mortal species rise and fall over the eons. Humanity was simply another brief flicker in the eternal darkness. They would burn brightly for a moment by cosmic standards, and then they would be gone. The humans, of course, knew nothing of this. They continued their short, desperate lives, unaware that they were being studied like bacteria under a microscope. They developed technology with remarkable speed, driven by an urgency that the immortals found almost painful to observe. Every human scientist knew they had only decades to make their contribution. Every human artist knew their window for creation was closing from the moment it opened. The Sanduan High Contemplative, a being who had spent the last 50,000 years considering the nature of existence, once remarked that watching humanity was like watching a fire burn. Beautiful, perhaps. Warm, certainly. But ultimately temporary, and one learned not to grow attached to temporary things. The elder races had been watching the cosmos for so long that they had developed a certain perspective on time. Events that seemed urgent to younger species were, to them, simply patterns that would work themselves out eventually. Problems that appeared catastrophic were merely fluctuations in a larger, calmer flow. They had learned patience in a way that shorter-lived beings could never. Understand that this patience had served them well for millions of years. They had avoided conflicts by simply waiting for their enemies to die of old age. They had solved problems by taking centuries to find perfect solutions rather than rushing toward imperfect ones. They had built their civilization slowly, carefully, with the knowledge that they had all the time in existence to get things right. But the universe, as they were about to learn, did not care about their patience. The universe did not care about their immortality. The universe was about to send them a problem that could not be waited out, could not be solved with careful deliberation, could not be addressed with the comfortable assumption that there would always be more time. And in that moment of crisis, the elder races would discover that their greatest strength had become their greatest weakness. Because somewhere, on a small blue world they had dismissed as a curiosity, there lived a species that had never had the luxury of patience. A species that had spent every moment of its existence fighting against the clock. A species that understood, in a way the immortals had long forgotten, that some things could not wait. The mortals were coming, and they were going to teach the universe a lesson it had not learned in 14 billion years. The first warning came from a Vethkari observation station at the edge of known space. The message was simple, confused, and then it was nothing at all. The station simply stopped existing. Not destroyed, the sensors showed. Not damaged. Just gone, as if it had never been there at all. The elder races had a name for what came next, though they had not spoken it in over 4 million years. They called it the hollow dot. It was not a creature in any sense that biology could define. It was not a machine that technology could explain. The hollow was absence given form, a wound in the fabric of existence itself. Where it passed, things simply stopped being. Matter, energy, even the empty vacuum of space itself was consumed, leaving behind something that was less than nothing. The philosophers struggled to describe it. The scientists could only measure the growing darkness where stars used to shine. The hollow had drifted through the cosmos before. Ancient records, so old that even the immortals considered them unreliable, spoke of its passage through distant regions of space. Each time, the elder races had simply moved. They had evacuated threatened systems, relocated their populations, and waited for the hollow to pass. What were a few thousand years of displacement to beings who lived forever? What were a few dozen star systems to a civilization that spanned millions? But this time was different. The hollow was not drifting. It was accelerating. And it was not moving in a random direction. It was converging, drawing together from multiple points across the galaxy. As if guided by some terrible purpose that no one could understand, the Council of Eternal Minds convened to address the threat. Representatives from every elder race gathered in the great chamber that floated between stars, a structure that had hosted deliberations for over 3 million years. The discussion began as all their discussions began, with careful analysis, long-term projections, and a deep consideration of all possible outcomes. The Vethkari presented models showing the Hollow's projected path over the next 100,000 years. The Zonduan contemplated the philosophical implications of engaging with a force that seemed to represent the opposite of existence itself. The Orcs calculated resource allocation scenarios that extended into the distant future, weighing the costs of various defensive strategies against the benefits of simply relocating again. The debate continued for 9 years. During those 9 years, the Hollow consumed 17 inhabited systems. Over 200 billion immortal beings ceased to exist. Their endless lives ended not by age or violence, but by simple erasure. The Council expressed appropriate concern and continued their deliberations. After all, rushing to a decision would be unwise. They had faced challenges before. They had always found solutions eventually. Meanwhile, the observation posts continued to send reports. The Hollow was not slowing. If anything, it seemed to be growing, feeding on the matter it consumed, becoming larger and faster with each system it swallowed. The models had to be revised, then revised again. Each revision showed a darker future, but still the Council debated. There were so many factors to consider, so many possible approaches to evaluate, so much time to find the perfect answer. Dai was a junior xenanthropologist named Kethvan who first thought of the mortals. Kethvan was young by Vethkari standards, barely 60,000 years old. He had spent the last 3 centuries studying humanity from the observation posts, fascinated by their strange existence. He had watched them struggle and fight and build, always racing against the biological clock that ticked inside each of them. He had seen them face disasters that should have ended their civilization, and somehow, impossibly, keep going. His proposal to the Council was not meant to be taken seriously. It was academic, he explained, a thought experiment. But perhaps, he suggested, they should warn the humans about the Hollow. Not because the mortals could help, of course. Their technology was primitive, their numbers insignificant, their lifespans too short to contribute anything meaningful. But observing how a mortal species reacted to certain extinction might provide valuable data. It might help the Council understand something about the nature of existence that they had forgotten in their millions of years of deathless life. The Council approved the study, almost as an afterthought. Resources were allocated. A small diplomatic team was assembled. Kethvan himself was chosen to make first contact. Since he knew the most about human behavior, he prepared for months, studying human languages and customs, trying to understand how to communicate with beings whose entire existence was shorter than some of his afternoon naps. He worried about how to break the news. How did you tell a species that they were going to be erased from existence? How did you explain a threat that even immortal minds struggled to comprehend? When he finally made contact, transmitting his message to the human communication networks, he expected confusion. He expected fear. He expected the kinds of reactions that mortal species always showed when faced with powers beyond their understanding. What he got instead was a response within 6 hours. A human woman appeared on his screen, her face lined with age in a way that made Kethvan unconsciously uncomfortable. She was wearing a military uniform covered in symbols he did not recognize, and her eyes held something he could not quite identify. She introduced herself as Admiral Chun, and she had questions, not questions about the nature of the Hollow, not questions about how to escape or where to hide. Her questions were tactical, strategic, She wanted to know how fast the hollow moved. She wanted to know if it had ever been damaged. She wanted to know what weapons had been tried against it and what the results had been. Kethvan answered as best he could, increasingly confused by her tone. She did not seem afraid. She did not seem resigned. She seemed like someone looking at a problem that needed to be solved, and solved quickly. When he finished explaining that the elder races had spent 9 years studying the hollow without finding a solution, the Admiral was silent for a long moment. Then she laughed. It was not a happy sound. She asked him one question that he would remember for the rest of his very long life. She asked him how many people had died. While the council was still talking, when he told her the number, 200 billion, she closed her eyes. And when she opened them again, he saw something in her gaze that he had never seen in any immortal being. He saw fury. He saw determination. He saw the look of someone who understood that time was running out and had decided to fight anyway. Within 72 hours, humanity had begun to move. Kethvan had studied humanity for 300 years. He had read their literature, analyzed their history, observed their behavior from the safe distance of orbit. He thought he understood them. He was wrong. The first sign that something unexpected was happening came when human ships began launching. Not in weeks or months, as the elder races would have required for proper preparation. Not after careful deliberation and risk assessment. The ships launched within days of Admiral Chun's conversation with Kethvan. They were not elegant vessels. They were not optimally designed. They were simply what humanity had available, and humanity had decided that available was good enough. Kethvan requested permission to observe the human mobilization directly. The council granted it, still treating the entire situation as an academic exercise. He traveled to the human home system, to a massive station orbiting their third planet, where he was met by Admiral Chun herself. She was older than he had expected from the video transmission. Her hair was gray, her face marked by decades of stress and responsibility. By Vethkari standards, she was already ancient, with perhaps 20 or 30 years left before her body simply stopped working. And yet she moved with a purpose that Kethvan had never seen in any immortal being. She gave him a tour of the mobilization efforts. Everywhere he looked, humans were working. Not the slow, careful work of beings with unlimited time, but frantic, urgent activity that seemed almost chaotic. Engineers were modifying ships that had never been designed for combat. Scientists were developing weapons based on theories that had not been fully tested. Soldiers were training for battles that had no precedent in human history. Kethvan asked how they could possibly prepare for a threat they barely understood in such a short time. Admiral Chun stopped walking and looked at him with an expression he could not read. She told him that humans had never had the luxury of full understanding. They had never had the luxury of perfect preparation. Every war they had ever fought, every challenge they had ever faced, had come with incomplete information and insufficient time. They had learned to act anyway. They had learned that an imperfect action taken now was worth more than a perfect action taken too late. She took him to a planning room where human strategists were studying the data the elder races had provided about the hollow. He watched them work, fascinated and confused in equal measure. They did not think in centuries or millennia. They thought in days, hours, minutes. They broke the problem into pieces small enough to address immediately. They assigned tasks with deadlines that would have seemed laughably short to any immortal. One of the strategists, a young woman who could not have been more than 30 years old, was arguing passionately for a particular approach. She spoke quickly, urgently, as if she knew that every second spent talking was a second not spent acting. When someone disagreed with her, she did not retreat to contemplate the objection for a decade. She addressed it immediately. adapted her plan, and moved forward. Kethvan asked Admiral Chun how humans could commit to plans without certainty that they would work. The Admiral smiled, though there was no humor in it. She explained that certainty was a luxury that mortals could not afford. Every decision they made, every day of their lives, was made without certainty. They got married without certainty. They had children without certainty. They built cities and nations and civilizations without any guarantee that those things would last. They had learned to act on probability, on hope, on sheer stubborn refusal to accept defeat. She told him something that he would think about for centuries afterward. She said that immortals feared death because they had so much to lose. But humans had already lost. They had lost from the moment they were born. Every human alive was already dying, already counting down the days until the end. And because they had nothing to lose, they had everything to fight for. The next day, Kethvan observed a memorial service for a human soldier who had died in a training accident. He expected despair, collapse, the kind of existential crisis that should come when a sentient being was reminded of their own mortality. Instead, he saw something else entirely. The other soldiers spoke about their fallen comrade. They told stories of his life, his achievements, his dreams. They cried, yes, but they also laughed. They honored his memory not by retreating from the universe, but by committing even more strongly to the fight ahead. One of them, an older man with scars on his face, said that the best way to honor the dead was to make their sacrifice mean something. Kethvan realized that he had misunderstood everything about humanity. The elder races saw death as the ultimate tragedy, the worst thing that could happen to any being. They had built their entire civilization around avoiding it. But humans did not see death as the worst thing. They saw meaninglessness as the worst thing. A life cut short in service of something greater was not a tragedy to them. A life lived in safety, but without purpose was. He returned to the planning room and watched as humanity prepared to do what the elder races had spent 9 years failing to do. They were going to attack the Hollow, not because they were confident of victory, not because they had calculated favorable odds. They were going to attack because the alternative was to do nothing, and doing nothing while others suffered was something their brief. Burning souls simply could not accept. Admiral Chun found him standing at a window, watching the ships prepare to launch. She asked him if the elder races would join them, if beings who had lived for millions of years would stand beside creatures who measured their lives in decades. Kethvan did not know how to answer. He told her, honestly, that he did not think his people understood what they were seeing. Humanity's urgency, their willingness to act without certainty, their ability to find meaning in sacrifice, these things were foreign to immortal minds. The elder races needed time to adjust. The Admiral nodded. She did not seem surprised. Then she said something that cut through all of Kethvan's careful academic understanding and touched something deeper. She said that was fine. Humanity had been fighting alone since before they climbed down from the trees. They knew how to stand on a line that everyone else had abandoned. They would hold the darkness back as long as they could. And maybe, if there was any justice in the universe, that would be long enough for the immortals to remember what it meant to truly live. The first human fleet departed 12 days later. They flew toward the Hollow with nothing but unproven weapons, untested theories, and the absolute conviction that dying for something mattered more than living for nothing. Kethvan watched them go and felt something he had not felt in 60,000 years. He felt ashamed. The fleet was called Expeditionary Force Defiance. 47 ships carrying 18,000 human beings towards something that had erased civilizations older than their sun. Admiral Chun stood on the bridge of the flagship, a vessel named Remember Why We Fight, and watched the darkness grow larger in the viewscreen. Kethvan had insisted on coming. He told himself it was for research purposes, to document how a mortal species behaved in its final moments. But somewhere in the part of his mind that he did not like to examine, he knew that was not the whole truth. He had watched these creatures prepare for death with a courage he could not understand, and he needed to see what happened next. The hollow filled the view screen now, a wound in space where stars should have been. It was not black, not exactly. Black was still something. This was nothing, an absence so complete that the eye could not fully process it. Looking at it made Kethvon feel dizzy, disoriented, as if his immortal mind was struggling to accept that such a thing could exist. The human crew showed no such hesitation. They moved with practiced efficiency, preparing weapons that had never been tested in actual combat. There was fear in the room, yes. Kethvon could see it in the tight shoulders and the clenched jaws. But there was something else too. Something that looked almost like excitement. Admiral Chun gave the order to begin the attack. The first wave of missiles launched toward the hollow. They were experimental weapons designed in the 2 weeks since humanity had learned of the threat. The theory was that focused energy, applied at precisely the right frequency, might disrupt whatever process allowed the hollow to consume matter. The theory had never been tested. There had been no time for testing. The missiles disappeared into the darkness. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the sensors detected something that made even the human crew fall silent. The hollow had flinched. It was subtle, a tiny fluctuation in the boundary between existence and absence. But it was real. For the first time in recorded history, something had caused the hollow to react as if in pain. Admiral Chun did not hesitate. She ordered the second wave, then the third. More missiles poured into the darkness, each one a guess, a hope, a desperate prayer translated into technology. Some had no effect at all. Others caused that same small flinch, that same brief hesitation in the hollow's advance. The creature, if that was what it was, began to move toward them. Kethvon felt true fear for the first time in thousands of years. The hollow was coming, and it was coming fast. And suddenly, the comfortable assumption that he could observe from a safe distance seemed ridiculous. He was going to die here, in this small metal box, surrounded by beings who had known their whole lives that this moment would come. He looked at the humans around him and saw something that broke his understanding of the universe. They were not running. They were not screaming or crying or collapsing into despair. They were fighting harder. The fear was still there, but it had been transformed into something else, a fierce determination that burned like fire in their eyes. They knew they might die. They had always known they would die, and they had decided that if death was coming, they would meet it on their feet. Admiral Chun gave an order that Kethvon would remember for the rest of his very long life. She ordered the fleet to advance. Not retreat, not hold position. Advance. Toward the thing that had swallowed stars. Toward the darkness that had erased billions of immortal beings. She ordered 18,000 mortals to fly directly into the mouth of oblivion, and not a single one of them refused. The battle that followed was chaos. Ships dove toward the hollow, firing everything they had, and some of them never came back. The darkness swallowed them whole, crews and all, ending lives that had only decades left anyway. But the survivors kept coming. For every ship that fell, 3 more pressed the attack. For every weapon that failed, 10 more were launched. And slowly, impossibly, the hollow began to retreat. Kethvon watched in disbelief as the absence drew back from the human assault. It was not a full retreat, not a victory in any meaningful sense, but it was something that had never happened before. The hollow, the thing that had drifted unchallenged through the cosmos for millions of years, was giving ground to creatures who lived for less than a century. The battle lasted for 18 hours. When it was over, 11 human ships remained. 7,000 of the 18,000 who had come were gone, erased as completely as if they had never existed. The hollow had withdrawn, not far, but far enough to give the survivors time to regroup. Admiral Chun sat in her command chair, covered in the dust of failing systems and the weight of 7,000 lost lives. She was crying, Kethvan realized. Tears ran down her aged face as she read the list of the dead. But her voice was steady when she made her report to Human Command. She told them what they had learned. The hollow could be hurt. The hollow could be pushed back. The hollow could be fought. Then she said something that would change the course of galactic history. She said that humanity would hold the line. They would keep attacking, keep sacrificing, keep fighting for as long as it took. But they could not do it alone. They needed the elder races to wake up. They needed immortals to remember that some things were worth dying for. Kethvan transmitted her words to the Council of Eternal Minds, along with the sensor data from the battle. He added his own observation, the most important thing he had learned in 300 years of studying humanity. He told the Council that the mortals were not fighting because they thought they could win. They were fighting because fighting was what gave their brief lives meaning. They were fighting because the alternative was to accept that existence did not matter. And that was something their mortal souls simply could not do. And then he said something that shocked the Council to its core. He said that after watching humans face death with such courage, he was no longer certain that immortality was a gift. Perhaps it was a cage. Perhaps the elder races had been prisoners of their own endless lives for so long that they had forgotten what it meant to truly live. Perhaps, he said, it was time for the immortals to learn from the mortals. The Council debated for 3 days. Then, for the first time in 4 million years, they voted to go to war. The war lasted 11 years. In the long history of the elder races, this was barely a moment. In human terms, it was nearly a generation. Children were born during the war who would never know a universe without the hollow. Soldiers grew old on the front lines. Their brief lives spent holding back the darkness. Admiral Chun did not live to see the end of it. She died in the 4th year, not in battle but from the simple failure of her mortal body. She was 73 years old, ancient by human standards, and she had spent her final decade fighting a war that seemed impossible to win. The day she died, Kethvan was at her bedside. He had become something that no Vethkari had ever been before, a friend to mortals. He had fought alongside humans for 4 years, and he had learned more about existence in that time than in 60,000 years of immortal life. Admiral Chun's last words to him were simple. She told him to keep fighting, not because victory was certain, not because the math worked out. She told him to keep fighting because giving up was worse than dying. She told him that the universe did not care if you won or lost, but it remembered if you stood or fell. And then she closed her eyes, and the woman who had taught immortals how to fight was gone. Kethvan kept his promise. The war continued, and slowly, painfully, the tide began to turn. The elder races had entered the conflict hesitantly at first, sending resources and technology, but few actual soldiers. But something changed as they fought alongside humanity. They saw mortals sacrifice themselves to save immoral comrades. They saw humans who knew they had only years left choose to spend those years on the front lines. They saw courage that their million-year-old philosophies had no framework to explain. And one by one, the immortals began to change. The Vethkari were the first. Young soldiers, barely a few thousand years old, volunteered for missions that their elders considered suicide. They fought with a fury that shocked their commanders, attacking the hollow with the same desperate intensity that humans showed. When asked why, they gave answers that would have been unthinkable before the war. They said that existing was not the same as living. They said that eternity meant nothing if it was spent cowering from shadows. The Sanduan followed. Their slow stone minds finally moved to action by the example of beings who lived faster than they could think. The Orcs calculated new strategies, abandoning their cautious projections for aggressive approaches that accepted higher risks. Even the oldest of the elder races, beings who remembered the birth of stars, began to fight as if they had something to lose, because they had finally understood that they did. The hollow was pushed back slowly, system by system, year by year. The cost was enormous. Humanity lost 60% of its fleet over the course of the war. They lost colonies and stations. They lost 17 billion people, each one a universe of thoughts and dreams and hopes that would never be fulfilled. They grieved for every loss, and then they went back to the line, because grief had never stopped humans before in the 11th year. The combined forces of the galaxy drove the hollow to the edge of known space. The final battle was fought at a place that had no name, a region of emptiness between galaxies where nothing existed except the wound in reality, and the beings who had come to close it. HFY fought in that battle. He was no longer the distant academic who had first contacted humanity. He was a soldier, scarred by years of combat, changed in ways that his people had never imagined possible. He fought alongside humans and alongside immortals, and he could no longer tell which group he belonged to. The hollow was not destroyed. Perhaps it could not be destroyed, not truly, but it was driven back, forced to retreat into the void between galaxies, pushed so far from inhabited space that it would take millions of years to return. The universe would have time to prepare. The universe would remember what had been learned. After the war, there was a ceremony. The survivors gathered at a place called Kesran Margin, where the first human fleet had made its stand 11 years before. A memorial was built there, constructed from the hulls of fallen ships, both human and immortal. It floated in space, a monument to those who had given everything. HFY spoke at the dedication. His words were translated into 14,000 languages and broadcast to every world in the galaxy. He told the story of the war, but more than that, he told the story of what the war had taught the elder races. He said that for millions of years, the immortals had pitied mortals. They had seen death as a curse, a limitation, a tragedy that enlightened beings should overcome. They had built their civilization on the assumption that existence was the highest good, that length of life was the measure of success. But the mortals had shown them something different. The mortals had shown them that a life measured in decades could contain more meaning than a life measured in millennia. The mortals had shown them that the awareness of ending was not a curse, but a gift. A constant reminder that every moment mattered, that every choice had weight, that every action was precious because it could not be taken back. The immortals had lived for millions of years, but they had not truly lived. They had existed. They had continued. They had drifted through eternity like leaves on an endless river, never making choices that mattered because they always assumed they would have more time. The mortals had taught them that there was never more time. There was only now. There was only this moment, this choice, this chance to make something that mattered. And beings who understood that, truly understood it, were capable of things that immortals could never imagine. The memorial at Kesran Margin still stands. The inscription on it has been read by billions of beings from thousands of species. It has been quoted in philosophical texts and military academies and government chambers across the galaxy. It says, "They asked us how we could be so brave, knowing we would end. We asked them how they could be so still, knowing they would not. The elder races still do not truly understand death. They still live their endless lives, still count their years in millions, still exist in a way that mortals never will. But something changed in them during the war. Something woke up that had been sleeping for a very long time. Now, when a new immortal is born, they are told the story of the mortals who taught the universe to fight. They are told about Admiral Chun, who died at 73 and changed the course of history. They are told about the 18,000 humans who flew into darkness because doing nothing was worse than dying. They are told about the brief, burning lives that saved the galaxy. And they are told the lesson that humanity taught the stars. Death is not the enemy. Meaninglessness is the enemy. A life lived in service of something greater. A life that ends in the defense of others. A life that burns briefly but brightly. That is not a tragedy. That is a triumph. The mortals understood this from the beginning. Now, finally, so do the immortals. And somewhere in the void between galaxies, the hollow drifts and waits. But it is no longer feared as it once was, because the universe has learned that even absence can be pushed back, even darkness can be defied, even endings can be faced with courage. All it takes is beings brave enough to fight. All it takes is creatures who understand that the clock is always ticking. All it takes is mortals.